Hello guys and girls, and I hope you're all well, and you join me in the AMX-30. Now, this is the final sort of tank, the main battle tank for the French forces, and in the French tech tree. Now this is the 1972 model, so there is a secondary model, which is the slightly later variant, which does have a slightly different engine, but it also carries a slightly different shell with it. Let's start with talking some history on this tank. Now, this tank originally started out as the 25-ton Bataillon-Chatillon light medium tank in 1958, and it was going to be the new French main battle tank, based on the new modern thinking, like the Leopard 1s, the T-62s, the chieftains and centurions, the more modern battle tanks, faster, not needing as much armor, better guns, all of that aspect. Now the Bataillon Chatillon, I'm sorry if I completely murdered that pronunciation, had an oscillating turret. The chassis was relatively similar. That bit, it did have some changes, but the chassis was relatively similar. But it was again going to have an oscillating turret because French love oscillating turrets. However, this was scrapped because the oscillating turret, other than having a weak point at the chin, also was very hard to seal, and this meant that in a nuclear blast, then radiation would seep into the tank. They couldn't seal the tank properly, so they had to go with a more traditional design for the turret. Hence we got the AMX-30. Now, it was built in June of 1966 and had a part cast, part welded hull. It was very similar to the Leo in its shape, but it was a bit lighter. It was probably it was one of the lightest European main battle tanks. It was more in line with the Swiss Panzer 61, I think it is. 61. But it also had a very low profile, similar to that of the T-55 of Russia. It lacked armour, but it went for mobility. Speed and mobility over armour, allowing it to get places and dodge shells rather than have to rely on having armour to stop shells, because with the advancement of munitions at the time, rounds were becoming so good at penetrating there were not much to stop them. And this was a time before composite armour was really a thing. It was starting to be produced, but it was very expensive, and it was kind of like, okay, we'll make it fast and agile and low profile. So that was the decision made. The armament was the 105mm F1 cannon, and well, I'll get back to that very shortly. It also had a 20mm autocannon installed in it, as well as a 7.5mm machine gun on top of the turret, and this machine gun was designed for crowd control, things like that. As you can see, it's just on the commander's cupola there. The commander has access to that machine gun. It's also used for anti-aircraft activities. The 20mm we see here at the front, and if we just X-ray in, you can see it's quite a large old gun. The belt is fed into this section here. That was actually used for taking out helicopters. It was designed to take out helicopters and threats like that, also lightly armoured targets, of course. Now, the tank was relatively successful all in all. It wasn't a terrible vehicle. There was the evolution of it, and the B variant, which is the next to the B2, was made in 1980, and that had the armor-piercing fin-escape stabilised Toscano Sabo rounds, tungsten round basically, which had a very big amount of punch to it. One of the things this tank does miss is stabilizers for the gun. It has got stabilization for the the commander and the gunner, but not for the actual gun itself, which is probably the biggest weak point of this vehicle, and the thing that really does kill it. It makes it very tricky to use in gameplay. Also, the aforementioned round as well. You've got a heat round, and unfortunately it's not correctly working in game yet. I'll get into that in a moment for you though, because I will talk more in detail about that once I fire a shot off. Now, the tank saw service up until the 90s, and I believe it's still in service in some countries. It saw service quite a large market, with Germany being forbidden to, due to its constitution, to sell tanks to autocratic regimes. Some of the other countries, France in particular, did win out with that, being able to sell the AMX-30. Bosnia, Chile, Cyprus, Greece, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Spain, Tunisia, Venezuela all had these tanks. It did also see service with the French during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War that is, Operation Desert Storm in '91, where it had relatively good success rates. The AMX-30s in the AMX-30s in the attack managed to take out 10 tanks, and also numerous other vehicles. They managed to take down 10 tanks. The AMX-30s in the Qatari army managed to take out several T-55s. So it did well in service. It operated quite well all in all. Now we're just going to come around the corner here in a moment, hopefully, and get to see this gun in action. Now, the gun itself has got very good gun handling. It's very easy to aim, and it's relatively good to use. Now, the gun has HE rounds as well as the high explosive anti-tank rounds, but also can carry the smoke shell as well. Now, being a late war gun, a late period gun, interwar Cold War gun, oddly enough, it's not smoothbore. This is a rifled gun, and this is why it has the heat shell in it. The French preferred the rifling on a gun, and they found it gave it much better stability, as well as better. It worked better in general. They found the gun to work very well with the rifled rounds in there. Now, there's an IS-6 just to my right-hand side that I will notice hopefully in a moment. There we go. So, I'm just going to slow down a little bit here. We get on aim, get on target, and as you can see, it's got very good velocity. Now, we're just going to switch to the free camera here, because I just want to talk about the shell. Now, normally I don't really talk about shells very much in game, because there's not much to talk about them. However, this shell is a very special shell. Unfortunately, it's not modelled, so it kind of breaks it. This is the Oberst. The full name is the Oberst à charge sur the 155mm Modèle F1, or shortened to Oberst G, and it's a heat projectile. Now, this projectile is fired from, as I said, a rifled barrel. Let's just go back, and there'll be a bit of muzzle breach coming out, as you can see. So there's a little bit of flame coming out here, but we should be able to see the rifling on the gun. So, we've got a rifled barrel firing a heat round. And unlike most trajectories of this time period, it's not fin stabilized. Because by this time, heat fin stabilized was the most common used round, and the one that most people had for their tanks and their guns. So the French, just to be different, use this. Now, what I'm going to pull up on screen right now is the blueprints of this shell, and as you can see, it looks a bit different in game. But what we have here is essentially a twin set round. So I'll just slow it down quite a bit here. I'll just jump back to the game quickly. Just go as slow as possible. And as it's travelling through the air in this terribly jerky motion, probably not easy to see, but there will be some spin on this. Now, it's not showing up in the game, unfortunately, but when it's travelling, it will be spinning in a clockwise rotation. However, inside, it's perfectly still, and this is to keep it balanced. It's a very well balanced shell. Now, this is a shape charge as well, so much like the bazooka round or the Panzer my brain's gone dead there for a second. I know what I'm trying to say, but I can't remember it. Basically like a bazooka round or anything shape charged. So what we have in here is two separate shells essentially. But what this did is it meant that the tank shell, well this shell, had greater stability and could actually be fired with good accuracy at over 3,000 meters. It was very, very effective, and it was very, very good. It also had a huge amount of armor penetration as well. The big thing with this shell is it actually had up to 400, I think it was. I have to look just through my notes again, sorry, just as I'm doing this. The practical range was 3,000 meters, and the warhead had 780 grams of effective filler inside, so explosive filler. So very high amount of explosive filler in the hexagonal filled cap, but also very stable. So the aiming of this gun was very easy. The shell was very, very easy to get on target. It didn't get off course, and even in strong wind conditions, the shell would not go off course, and that was the big advantage of not having it fin stabilized, because with the fin stabilized shell, what can happen sometimes is this has a big cross breeze. Because of the fins on the back, it can just wobble the shell a little bit and can lose accuracy at very, very long range. Whereas this, because it is rifled, it's using inertia, it loses a little bit less accuracy in higher wind conditions. Now, not to say it's not going to lose any, but it is a little bit more accurate. And they found that this shell was very, very accurate. But also, it had a ridiculous amount of penetration. It was capable of defeating 400 millimeters of armor at pretty much any range as well. Because it's a shape charge, it didn't matter what range it was fired at, it would always have the same effect. So, unfortunately, it doesn't work in-game. So we'll just hop back now and we'll just slow motion. Oh, that's a bit too fast actually. That's the trouble with these shells, they're quite fast moving objects. So the shell's coming in nice here. IS-6 here on the side. And we're going to go straight into the side of him. Good position for hitting. We actually hit a little bit low, but we sort of get him in the engine bay. Shell goes off. And we cause some good damage there. So as you see with the replay there down in the bottom, we blow the engine of that tank, cause a fire, and stop him. Now we're going to follow up with a secondary shell. Secondary shell goes straight in again, takes out the whole crew. So it's very good against armour, this round. But as I said, unfortunately, it's not been modelled correctly and the damage effects aren't working. It's effectively the same as any other heat round, and that's very, very disappointing because it should be far, far more effective. This was very advanced at the time. And as I said, it worked very, very well. The other thing as well is it could be used on driven on conveyor belts, things like that. It was very easy to load. It didn't have the fragility of a fin stabilised round, where sometimes the fins would break or fins wouldn't deploy properly, so there was less chance of issues there. Now, as I say, they did actually develop a fin stabilised version, and it's one of the few guns out there that fires a fin stabilised shell through a rifle turret. Because what can happen with fin stabilised is you generally don't want them moving, you want them to stay sort of still in the air. Some of them will have a very slow rotation to them, but the majority of them don't really rotate, they just go straight through the air. The way the French got around this is they actually had it in a Savo shell, and fired it. So they had it in a very similar looking shell, and then it would discard, and then the rest of it would come out. The arm-piercing fin stabilised discarding saber they used actually had a little bit of rotation on it as well, so it worked very, very well. It was a good little shell, and that's what they used in the B models. Now, the AMX-30 had a lot of different models and various models to it as well. There are a lot of different variants of them. There is actually there was a later model, the AMX-32, I believe it was, which was very similar, but it actually had spaced armour, and it didn't actually come up. It was prototyped, but it wasn't fully made. And I just wonder why that hasn't been added to the game. With ERA and things like that, it would kind of make sense to actually get the 32 instead of the B model. Have the B as the standard AMX-30, or even have the AMX-32 as a separate model, because it just makes no sense. Now here again, we're at long range here. I can't actually see what we're firing against. Long range, fire off a shot. We get an easy hit straight into the track there. The gun is very good to use, and you do get hits very easily with this gun. Unfortunately, the damage aspect post-penetration is atrocious, and that's a very good example of how bad it is. Much like the heat fin stabilised of the AMX-1390, it really affects the gun. It just makes the tank feel utterly useless sometimes. So as I was saying, there was a lot of different verifications. There was also the AMX-30 ACRA, which was basically a Sheridan variant. It had a 142mm gun, which was capable of firing a anti-char rapide auto-repulse anti-tank guided missile. Similar to the Shillelagh missiles that are fired from the Sheridan. So this, again, is a tank that I think, well, why didn't we possibly get that? We've got the option for adding in these prototype tanks that didn't really go into battle. And there are a fair few of these actual tanks in the French tree already, so why didn't we get some of the more interesting ones added? Other than that, there were also the AMX-30 DCA self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, which we do have in game, which has twin 30mm guns, I think it is off the top of my head. Very much like the Falcon from Britain. It uses the Hispano-Suiza 831A 30mm gun. There are also many rocket variants of this tank as well. Most of them were SAM missile guided systems, but there was also a few models that were used for tactical missiles as well, and those we won't obviously get in game, but they were interesting nonetheless. All in all, the AMX-30 does... It's an okay tank. It feels a bit like a mixture of a T-55 with the Japanese tanks. You know, it's sort of... It feels very much like the Japanese tanks with the armour values, or lack thereof, but just the lack of having a stabilizer on the gun really does affect this vehicle's playability. The 20mm autocannon really can help you out sometimes because you can take out lightly armoured tanks relatively easily. This game's a relatively boring game, so I do apologise about that, but it's probably the best game I've had in this tank yet. Now we are getting attacked by a BMP, which is just completely fluffed up its missiles here, and he's just been taken out. Unfortunately, we missed the chance to take him out, but everybody's launching their machine guns at him just to make sure he's dead. And that's where the 20mm really come in useful, is for light vehicles, because you've got relatively good penetration with them. All in all, the tank is decent, and it's an okay final main battle tank to get. It's not the best main battle tank out there, and it really does suffer from having a very poor round. The round in game only has 360mm of effective penetration, whereas in real life it was more towards the 400 mark. The post-penetration damage is also very, very poor. Now, the early heat rounds, absolutely that was the case, but later models, and this in particular, had a very, very deadly post-penetration ability. So the fact that it's not modelled correctly in game does bother me a bit. It just doesn't seem like it's been correctly tweaked for this vehicle, so it doesn't seem to work properly. But as I said, all in all, it is a good vehicle. Now we'll head back to the hangar now, and I'll just show you in the hangar view for it. Once we get there. It's also a very good looking tank as well. That's definitely something I should add to it. So the armour is relatively poor, in all honesty. You've got about 170, 180mm of effective armour around the front area. The turret is not going to stop much at all. You're pretty much going to get penetrated by everything at max BR with the guns. There are some nice angles, so sometimes you will bounce shots, but you can't really rely on it. As I said, the biggest strength of this tank is its gun. It has got a very good gun. Sorry, I didn't need to click on modifications. The gun is very good. The crew are relatively close together, however the large breach of the gun does mean usually if you do get penetrated, usually some of your crew do survive the hit, but only having 4 crew you do tend to go down relatively quickly. Ammunition is stored in the front and in the back of the turret. The front, however, does have this fuel tank, which does tend to save it from getting ammo racked. Sometimes the fuel tank does eat shots. Now, what am I doing? Clicking on the wrong things. Absolutely clicking on the wrong things there. But all in all, it's a decent tank. The biggest letdown, as I said, is the fact that it doesn't have any stabilizing unit. Now, I've been looking through details about that, and there are reports and there are blueprints of it having stabilizers. With the 1972 model did have a stabilizer. As I said, I do believe it was only on the sight system, which if we look in the gunner's sight, you can see the optics here. It's a very big optic system, and that was all stabilized, but the gun itself wasn't, which makes no sense to me whatsoever, but what can I say? I'm a civilian, I don't understand the French gun making techniques. But that really does make this tank very hard to use in top tier games, because every other battle tank on the field has that ability to fire shots on the move. Stationary, though, you do have that ability to fire some good shots. The penetration value of your round is good, but as I said, it is a bit balked at the moment. It does need fixing by Gaijin. The AMX-30 the model, which is the next one up, and it's a whole 1 BR higher, so it's 8.7. The only real difference is the engine. It has a slightly upgraded engine to it. It also does have the slightly different optics to it as well. It has slightly better night vision optics and things like that, which doesn't make a blind bit of difference in the game. The engine is a slightly more powerful engine, so it does mean it has more power, but it doesn't really affect the speed or the acceleration much. The only big difference is the rounds it gets. Again, it starts off with the same round, but you do get the tungsten round for it as well, the thin stabilized discarding sabot round, which does have very good penetration once more. It's one of the highest penetrative rounds in the game. The velocity of the shell is very good still, with the heat as well being over 1,000 meters per second. It is a very good and fast shell. The discarding sabot shell is 1,500. Again, these are things that I've got various different numbers from different websites and different places, so again, it's a bit hard to say. But all in all, it's not a bad tank, it's just not the best tank. It's not the best tank for top tier gameplay. Okay guys, I hope you found this video useful and interesting and whatnot. Let me know in the comments below what you think. If you've got this tank, let me know what you think of it. As I said, it's not a bad tank, don't get me wrong, but it's not great. I know I'm not really giving it a very good good sum up here, really, am I? It's just, I think, like a lot of things, it just needs fixing before it can be truly great. If the heat shell is fixed and works how it should work, then I think this tank is going to be a force to be reckoned with, and that's really going to affect how it plays. Until then, it is a bit hard to play, and you will find a lot of the time it takes at least 5 or 6 shots to kill a tank, unless you get lucky and hit the ammo. Even so, sometimes I've hit the ammo with this round and not caused an ammo explosion, so it's very hit or miss. The 20mm is a big help, and it does take down planes relatively easily as well. You will absolutely rip planes apart with it, which is very handy, and it does have good penetration value as well, with 42mm, about 40mm of effective penetration at 500 meters. The 7.62mm machine gun is pretty useless, but it does give you some nice traces. Okay guys, until next time, this is Screezilla out. Bye bye.